For Devember 19th in YouTuberizer, research. Lots of research. Hello, fellow Sublime Text Fanatics. Odat Nerd here with your Devember devlog update for Devember the 19th, which is a weekend day, which means I really only had a little bit over an hour to work on this stuff because aside from the standard weekend tasks of, chores and just spending time with the family and doing family related things, it is getting perilously close to Christmas and it is cookie time. So, only a little over an hour sunk into this project, but we got a lot of peanut butter balls created. A lot of peanut butter balls. But anyway, if you remember yesterday's devlog update, the thing that we were working on was the solution to the problem that loading up the encrypted data of the cache at startup time takes longer than actually fetching the data to begin with, which is, not great. I had a couple of ideas for how to resolve that. And when I looked at the code, now what we were trying to do yesterday was have the initialization of the cache happen sometime at startup between when startup happens and when the first request is made by having the network manager spawn off a separate thread to load that in the background. And I was having some problems with Sublime crashing. I was unable to replicate that today in anything that I was doing. However, I will point out that yesterday's devlog went out kind of late because I had a hell of a time getting the recording off of this system and it hung pretty hardcore and I had to do a complete reboot. So it even messed up my USB card. There's a very real possibility that there was just something a little funky going on with my system in general at that point. So I'm not really concerned about Sublime. But I was unable to resolve or recreate that problem. But what I actually discovered was it actually worked what I was doing. The code was a little bit more complicated than it needed to be for what it was because I was trying to do it piecemeal to throw in commits. But it's not a great experience for the user. And the reason for that is whether the load happens right at startup or later on, it is a rather significant CPU hit. The CPU really pegs while it's spending that 5 seconds or whatever it was actually doing it. So doing it right at startup actually lags Sublime and its startup because there's so much CPU being dedicated to it. Whereas if it's loaded at the point where it's first requested, which is what we had been doing, and we can see that code here from yesterday right now, then at least you took an action and you see the spinner happening. That's probably the thing you're trying to do right now, so that's more transparent. So I decided just to leave that as it is for now. But this did twig in my memory. Why is this so CPU intensive? It's this CPU intensive because I wanted to use AES encryption for this. Again, I'm not a cryptographer by any stretch of the imagination, but I wanted to use a really good, secure encryption mechanism for the credentials. Back when I originally implemented this last November, that was what was recommended at the time as being something really good, including a PBCK. If you're a cryptographer, you know what I mean. The type of key where, in order to crack it, takes ridiculous amounts of CPU or memory or both. Uh, yeah, we're using that as part of the encryption key. So the reason why this is so slow is that I'm using a pure Python implementation of AES. I'm pretty sure that's the reason. Now, I did that for a very specific reason, and that is that to use a library that does something like this in a package, you have to turn it into a dependency. And turning a dependency that's pure Python, turning a library that's a dependency into pure Python, fairly easy to do, particularly if said library is intelligent about how it works. Certainly, doing it in a dependency instead of vendoring is really easy in that case. Not so much if it uses some sort of native code, which those other libraries most definitely do. So, for expediency and having this work for me here on this Linux box on that Windows machine, the Windows machine out there, that Mac computer, that Windows laptop, that's blue right there, all of them pure Python, which means it absolutely works, but man, is it slow. So, we're going to leave that alone because that is a solvable problem. If we used a better library, we could do that. And we're going to kick that down the road because I'm using Sublime Text 4 right now when package control is able to handle dependencies for the new plugin host for Python 3.8, which is one of the new things we can do in Sublime Text version 4. It's going to have a different way to implement dependencies as well as standard libraries. And that means it's going to be very easy to use those libraries, particularly to find them, because right now this is running in the Python 3.3 plugin host because it needs a dependency, and those don't work in the 3.8 host. So we'll be able to solve that problem really easily as compared to what we have situated right now. So I'm going to kick that down the road. The next thing I just spent some time working with is the encryption of the data itself is pretty big, right? And part of the reason why it takes so much time to encrypt and decrypt it is that there's so much data there for it to work with. So, is there a way for us to work with data that's smaller? Then it would take less time, work better in the short term. And to that end, that's sort of a continuation of yesterday's idea of why are we indenting this data and bloating its size? Can we make this even smaller than it already is? The thing that came to mind for that, which I had never really used before, was Python's pickle action, which you can use to serialize an object to bytes and then restore it later. And in doing some tests, I discovered that I could do something like that, and the data was a lot smaller for the things that I was testing it with. So I spent some time working with and trying to quickly manipulate the code to use pickled data instead of JSON data to write it out to disk and load it back in. Which unfortunately did not go well for me because it seems like, and I didn't have tons of time by this point realizing what was going on to dig into this more deeply, that the Dotty library that we're using for our dictionaries might not react well to being unpickled. They can be pickled like nobody's business, but unpickled seemed to be a whole other thing entirely. It got itself into an infinite recursion looking for stuff. So maybe that is a more borderline solution until we get to the other one. But I may look into that more tomorrow. We'll see. Maybe it's a simple fix. I don't know. So that's the explanation for why, for all the time I spent on this today, I was mostly reading stuff and looking at stuff, double checking that there's not some way that I could try to hook into some new encryption action in the new plugin host, and not a good way anyhow. So what we actually have are just two commits, and they are solving bugs. And one of those is this very simple thing right here, which is that when the plugin loads, it used to start the network manager and then set some stuff up. Now it sets up the network manager after it's finished all initialization. That's just because maybe something in this wants to use settings. This should probably be configured first. That's not the case right now. If it did happen, we would immediately see it not working and wonder, why is this not getting settings? And then we would look and say, why are settings not loading? And then we'd see that the problem is that we're creating the object and then setting up the thing. So solvable problem, but fix a solvable problem when you see it before it happens. You don't have to run into it and waste time later, right? The other change we made similarly was this one here. There's actually two things. I changed the busy spinner text so that instead of loading data cache, it tells you what exactly it is it's loading, just to make a little bit more sense of what's actually happening there. That was while it was still actually loading the data right at startup, because otherwise you just see the spinner and you don't know why. One of the weird issues with that, by the way, is there's so much stuff going on at startup with the decryption that it actually stalled out the ability of Sublime's main thread to deliver notifications, so the spinner kind of stopped for a second, which is another reason why I decided not to do that. The other thing is that in the deauthentication routine here, I said, and I'm pretty sure I had, we should probably delete the stored cache when we log out, but that wasn't there. So I added it and also changed the order of these things, because if you call init cache before you actually delete the file, what it actually does is reload the file, so that it actually takes more time. Again, I'm pretty sure I had this in here yesterday, or I would have noticed when I made the other change that it wasn't having any effect on anything, because I did test all of those things. But I had some other miscellaneous changes in here that I ended up not committing because I knew things were broken. So I might have accidentally rejected some things in there. I think that is what was going on there. And that's all we have for this particular thing. I'm wearing the Sublime shirt. I don't know if I mentioned it because I had to take another take on this when something weird happened in the middle of a previous one. But I just finished recording some stuff for the video that's going to drop on the other channel on Monday. That's all we got for this one. I'm going to continue this work into tomorrow. I'm not entirely sure yet. Do I spend more time on pickling or we just start moving on with other things? Because I don't want to spend the entire Devember time trying to work around a problem that I know how to solve, but I'm waiting for the good solution to come. So we may just sort of set this by the wayside, call it good enough, maybe even make caching an optional thing. There is one more caching thing we have to do, which is making saving the data smarter instead of doing it every time, debounce it, maybe work on that, and then start working on some other stuff. So that's what we're going to be doing here until that next one or a video on the other channel. This is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day and happy holidays as well.